Hi guys, welcome to my channel. I am Daisy Demands, and in today's episode we are going to be reading the secret story at the end of Lally game. I have not read it. I have not made notes on it. I want to read it with you guys because I want to be just as surprised as you when I read it for the first time. So let's get into it. Gil grunted as he struggled to free a battered metal endoskeleton from beneath the edge of the wrapped wooden stage. Sweat that saturated his hair and forehead dripped from his left eyebrow into his eye. If you've ever had sweat go into your eye, you would know how much that stuff stings. We're never gonna get out of here, Gil grumbled, straightened and turned to survey the dingy ruins of the old pizzeria. He and his co-workers were charged with renovating. Gil didn't know how old the place was, but it definitely had seen better days. It was filthy and littered with trash and scrap, most of which consisted of discarded animatronic endoskeletons, heavy metal robotic parts. Gil was sick of dragging the things around. Gil reached for the water bottle he'd left on the edge of the stage. He took a swig and gazed at the seemingly endless work that lay ahead of him. Robotic endoskeletons, the vaguely human skeleton-shaped steel frameworks over which all Fazbear Enterprises animatronics were built, were piled everywhere. The place looked like the aftermath of a robotic Armageddon. Not only was the old pizzeria bulging with discarded metal skeletons, it was also filled with broken down tables and chairs and red vinyl top stools, stacks of wooden beams and cement blocks, and piles of concrete and metal rubble. Weirdly, bright blue, green and red plates and cups along with purple striped tablecloths were strewn amongst the larger debris. This part of the pizzeria was the main dining room, a large red-walled room dominated by a rectangular stage. Although the pizzeria's electrical systems were mostly shot and Gil had his teammates set up work lights around the room, the stage lights, for reasons no one understood, always shone brightly. A row of the round piercing lights lined the front of the stage and also encircled a smaller semicircular stage next to the large one on either end of the big stage. On either end of the big stage, more of the floodlights glared from rows of old speakers that sat silently, their black surfaces obstructed by who knows how many years of grime. Just as Gil sat down his water bottle and prepared to lean over the stuck endoskeleton, Danny, the eager beaver, 20-year-old who drove Gil nuts with his consistent cheerful chatter, "And isn't this fun?" attitude, crawled out from underneath the stage. Danny brought a cloud of dust with him. Gil wrinkled his nose at muted smell that wafted from under the stage's cracked front skirting, across the black and white checkered linoleum floor, and scooted away from the stage. He held the end of a rope that was tied to another endoskeleton and dragged the broken down robot frame behind him. It slid out easily, not caught on anything like the one Gil was dealing with. "This is the last one from way under the stage," Danny said. "It's so cool under there." "Cool?" Gil curled his lip. "Only if you'd like filth and cobwebs," he snorted and waved his hand to indicate the whole room that they were in. "There's nothing cool about this place." Danny sprang to his feet. He brushed off his perfectly creased khakis and his equally perfectly pressed denim shirt. Who ironed a denim shirt? Gil wondered. Danny looked and acted like a mama's boy. His precisely combed blonde hair and too cute face went with his merry attitude, his stories about his beloved mother and his obsession with following rules. Even though Gil was just a few years older than Danny, Gil thought Danny as a kid. Gil was Danny's opposite, since he'd never wore anything but jeans and t-shirts. Gil had never ironed anything. In his 24 years on the planet, how can you be 24 and not iron anything? 24 years on this planet, he did not even like his mum, and he avoided rules like the plague. Gil also would never be described as cute. He'd like to think of himself as rugged and bad. Gil was one of those guys women claimed to hate but secretly wanted. They couldn't resist his shaggy brown hair, unshaven face and brooding dark brown eyes. Gil shook his head. This job wouldn't be over fast enough to suit him, and not just because of working with guys like Danny. There's too much work here just for the four of us, Gil said. He looked across the room towards the other two men on the renovation team. Owen and Carlo were working together to add yet another endoskeleton to a growing stack near the only exit from the old pizzeria. All of the other doors and windows in the place were obstructed by heavy lumber and cement blocks. No way we're going to get everything done by the deadline they've given us, Gil continued. The suits have no idea how hard it is to break down these things. Gil gestured towards the endoskeleton. Danny was now dragging across the floor. If you stopped complaining so much, the work would go a lot faster, Danny said. Gil gave Danny a dirty look, which Danny ignored. Danny kept talking. These endoskeletons are fascinating, he said, and they were getting good exercise. It's like being paid to work out, as he flexed his admittedly impressive bicep and grinned. Plus, I think it's great how we're going to renovate this place back to how it was in the heyday. I heard they're thinking about not only sprucing it up and preserving it, but maybe even memorialising it, like turning it into a museum or something. I think that's awesome that they're building a new Pizzaplex above this old place. It's really an honour to be a part of this kind of project, so you know what it's from. You know what it's from. It's underneath the Pizzaplex. Gil rolled his eyes and turned back on Danny. I'm going outside to get some fresh air, Gil said. But you just took a break about 15 minutes ago, Danny said. Yeah, well, I'm taking another one. Deal with it. Gil headed towards the old pizzeria's only exit. Watching a downpour so heavy it looked like a grey curtain instead of an individual water drops. Theo buddied next to his co-worker and friend, Bryce, a tall, skinny guy who was a lot stronger than he looked. They were both attempting to shelter under the metal scaffolding, which wasn't up to the task of keeping them dry. Rain spattered Theo's heavy work boots as he frowned at the big delivery truck that was backing towards him with a shrill beep, beep, beep that cut through the crackling, drumming sounds of the rain. Theo coughed and turned away from the truck, smelly exhaust. Bryce covered his nose and shook his head. What's with the delivery? Bryce asked. Theo shrugged, and he and Bryce had been part of the construction team working on Freddy's Fazbear Mega Pizzaplex for several weeks, long enough for Theo to learn that asking questions was never a good idea. Theo thought that a lot of what went on in the Pizzaplex was strange, like building a modern entertainment complex over the remains of an old pizzeria, for instance. But Theo didn't care. The pay was great, the gig was a long one, even if after all this time the Pizzaplex was still a fledgling stage. It currently looked like a giant dome-shaped metal cage. Theo and his team, and all the other workers on the project, were just finishing up setting up their rebar and concrete that would make the skeletal structure of the building. The truck came to a stop and a big curly-haired guy jumped out of the cab, sheltering clipboard under lightweight jacket that was rain-saturated within seconds. The man ran towards Theo and Bryce. Theo stepped back to make room for the man, who smelled of sweat and spearmint. The man, popping the gum chewed vigorously, nodded thanks and shook himself like a dog. Theo and Bryce both sprayed. Theo pointed out that the man's clipboard. Do I need to sign? The man nodded and presented the clipboard to Theo. A gust of wind blew the rain under the scaffolding and the paper on the clipboard fluttered. Theo quickly scanned the wet page. He raised an eyebrow. State-of-art animatronics? Bryce was right. It was weird to be receiving these now, when the building was little more than an open framework. But Theo had been told that his team was supposed to receive and unload this shipment. So he signed the delivery order. Thanks, the big man said. He popped his gum turned and ran backwards towards his truck's cab. He tossed the clipboard inside and then trotted to the back of the truck. The man flipped the big metal latch and it made a metallic thunk. Then he threw up the door, which was ratcheted open with a series of squeaks and thuds. The man stepped back under the scaffolding together, and Theo and Bryce looked into the back of the truck. Bryce gasped. "Whoa," the man said. He stopped chewing his gum. Theo frowned. The delivery order had said new state-of-the-art animatronics. He pointed. "So what happened to that one?" The man shook his head. He strode forward and jumped into the back of the truck. Theo exchanged a look with Bryce and then followed the man. Bryce stayed where he was. The inside of the truck was dark and smelled like sawdust and motor oil. Rain pounding the truck's metal roof was amplified in the small space. It sounded like several people banging on the top of the truck with hammers. Theo and the truck driver studied the collection of friendly-looking animatronics. Theo's gaze shifted from one robot to the next. All of them were gleaming in brand new perfection. All of them, except one. This animatronic was anything but bright and shiny, friendly-looking. What could have done this? Theo asked. The truck driver shook his head and shuffled his feet vigorously. "I got no idea." Theo shook his head. "Well, they're gonna need another guitarist." "A guitarist? Is that Bonnie?" "Oh no." As soon as the back of the truck opened, Gil left the shelter of the cement half wall where he'd like to take his breaks. The wall was a few feet from the exterior framework of the Pizzaplex, and none of the construction workers had a problem with them hanging out there. Now, though, Gil stepped up beside the tall, thin guy who was weighted under the scaffolding. The guy didn't notice Gil at first. He was looking towards the big truck driver and the other guy, a broad-shouldered 30-something man with a receding hairline. Actually, the tall guy was looking beyond the driver. And the prematurely balding man, he was looking at the stripped-down robot. Gil looked at the robot too, grinning. He dashed through the rain and hopped onto the back of the truck. The men in the truck turned to look at him. "Hey!" Gil stuck out his hand towards the guy with too much forehead. "Gil, Theo!" Theo shook Gil's hand, but he was frowning, clearly wondering what Gil was doing there. "I'm part of the Renault crew," Gil explained as he pointed to the bare endoskeleton. "I'll take that one." Theo cocked his head. Gil didn't give Theo a chance to form a question. Gil stepped towards the 7-foot metal skeleton. He gripped its arm. This obviously wasn't going to be used for whatever those are for. He gestured at the new undamaged animatronics. "But it looks strong and sturdy, and I think I can repurpose it and use it to break down all the pile-up heavy trashed endoskeletons we were trying to clear out from the old pizzeria." "I don't think," Theo began. Gil bumped into Theo, forcing him to step back. Theo frowned but didn't stop Gil as he tipped the bare endoskeleton forward and began dragging it across the aluminium truck bed. The metal-on-metal screeched. Gil made sure the endoskeleton brushed against Theo, and he grinned when Theo jumped back even further. Gil knew his 6'2" frame and his "just try me" face would be enough to intimidate Theo into silence. Just to be sure, though, he glared a challenge at Theo. Theo raised both hands in a gesture of surrender. "Have at it," Theo said. Gil jumped into the rain and dragged his prize off the truck. By the time Gil managed to drag the endoskeleton into the old pizzeria, he was panting and sweating heavily. But he didn't care. This thing was going to make Gil's life so much easier. Gil laid the robot against one of the sidewalls of the pizzeria's dining room. He straightened and wiped his face with the back of his hand. "What the heck are you doing?" Carlo stepped up beside Gil and scowled at the bare bones robot. He too wiped his face. His dark skin glistened with sweat and moisture beaded up on the oak leaf tattoo from his forearm. "We're supposed to be getting them out, not bringing them in." Gil looked down at Carlo and clapped at the short, sturdy guy on the back. "This is going to do exactly that." Carlo frowned in confusion. Gil laughed. He looked at the stripped-down animatronics. "Stay there," he said to the robot. "I'll be right back." Gil ignored Carlo's baffled exasperation and strode across the room to what used to be the arcade part of the pizzeria. In the narrow aisles between dark and broken arcade games, Gil and his co-workers left their personal belongings during the day. The old pizzeria employees area was too filled with rubbish to use, and the temporary trailers set up outside the Pizzaplex's construction zone were earmarked for the construction crew, not the renovation crew. Of course, the Reno crew was treated like second-class citizens, but not for long. Gil was going to change that. Gil found his backpack next to Danny's shiny red lunch pail. Danny was such a little boy, and he quickly reached into it and pulled out his laptop. Finally, Gil was going to show the suits they'd been wrong to stick him in the crew doing the grunts work. When Gil applied for the job at the Pizzaplex, he thought he'd been chosen as part of the tech team. He didn't have any actual work experience as a programmer, but he tinkered with programs and robotics all the time at home, told the suits what an asset he'd be. But they didn't believe him, and he ended up down this hole, dragging around dead old robots. But not anymore. Gil hurried back to the prone endoskeleton. Carlo had moved off. He and Owen were now struggling to break down one of the endoskeletons stacked by the stage. Owen's bowling ball face was flushed red with exhaustion. "Suckers," Gil muttered. He opened his laptop and set it on the floor. Then he knelt next to his new worker robot. Whereas the endoskeletons Gil and his teammates had been hauling and dismantling were just metal versions of human skeletal systems, this endoskeleton was more substantial. It wasn't just basic metal structure, its steel frame was continued with a bulging collection of metal rods and curved plates, an impressive system of ball joints and pistons. All of this was topped with a long, vaguely rectangular-shaped shiny steel skull. The skull was the only part of the endoskeleton that was shiny. The rest was dark and discoloured, as if it had survived some kind of fire. The upper part of the shiny skull contained bulging white eyes. I know who that is. Do you know who that is? Bulging white eyes encased in steel sockets, and the lower part contained a hinged metal-toothed mouth jutting from the top of the head. A pair of bent metal ears stuck out like antennae. Feeling around the back of the base of the metallic skull, Gil found a small switch. He pressed it and the robot's jaw shifted forward with a faint whir. The jaw clicked into full open position, revealing the mass of circuits and chips and wires within the skull. Gil probed the wires and found one that had a power coupler. He gently pulled it out and connected it with his laptop. As soon as the animatronic was linked to Gil's computer, its specs and operating system code scrolled down the laptop screen. Gil leaned forward and scanned the code. When he saw what he was looking for, he reached out and tapped a few keys. Cleanup protocol check. Gil's gaze shifted from his laptop to the robot and back again to the screen. After a few seconds, the screen prompted protocol upload. Gil disconnected his laptop from the robot. He started to reach for the animatronic's jaw, but he paused when a shadow fell over the keyboard. He looked up. Danny, looking as clean and fresh as he had at the start of the day, was staring at the endoskeleton. "What are you doing?" Danny asked. "I didn't think any of these things worked." "This is a new one," Gil said. "I've activated cleanup protocol." Gil reached out and pushed the robot's jaw back into place. As soon as the whir and click ended, the white eyes glowed orange. The robot's joints hummed and hissed as it sat up. Danny yelped. Gil grinned. When Danny took several stuttered steps backwards out of the corner of his eye, Gil saw Carlo and Owen join Danny, goggled at the animatronic with a rumbling chirr. The robot turned its head and looked directly at Gil. The square metal-toothed mouth emitted a metallic rasp as it hinged open. "Awaiting instructions," the robot said in that flat, deep voice. "Cool," Danny said. Gil turned to grin at the kid. He chuckled when he saw that Owen and Carlo were sliding away. Gil turned back to his new robot. He leaned in his radiant eyes. "I want you to break the limbs and heads off all the endoskeletons in this place and pile them up over there." He pointed towards the pile of animatronics parts by the exit door. Easy peasy. Got it? The robot's internal mechanism cracks and groaned. The robot's mouth creaked as it opened again. Break off limbs and heads. Pile them up. Easy peasy. Got it? The robot looked directly at Gil for several seconds. Gil shook off a sudden shiver. The robot's glowed-eyed gaze was creepy, but then the animatronic couldn't help that it didn't have a face. The robot's joints clicked and servos droned as it abruptly rose to its feet. Once upright, its hard metal edges reflected the stage lights behind it, making it look like it was radiating heat. To disguise an unbidden flinch, Gil quickly stood too. You can start by taking inventory, Gil said to the robot. The robot shifted its feet, finding its balance. Something tucked into place in its midsection. Other robot parts clacked and thumped. The animatronic's eyes pulsed with luminescence as it slowly and deliberately turned to scan the room. It rotated in a full circle, its gaze taking in all the robot remains scattered throughout the place. When the robot finished its rotation, its attention zeroed in on Gil and the other team members. The robot took a step forward, its heavy steel foot grating across the bare floor. The robot's eerie eyes locked on Gil, and then moved to Danny, and then to Owen, and finally Carla. Gil's shiver returned. He glanced over at the others. Danny's eager expression had collapsed into nervousness. He exchanged a look with Carlo, whose forehead was bunched into a worried frown. Owen wore a pinched expression that could have been annoyance, or fear, or both. Gil had to admit he'd found the robot's scrutiny a little unsettling. A barely discernible wheezing sound was coming from the animatronics systems. Gil wasn't sure what the sound meant. Was everything functioning properly? When the newly animated endoskeleton took a step, Gil nearly jumped out of his skin. He pretended like he just tripped over something and stepped aside as the robot strode past him. Gil was embarrassed by his reaction, but he immediately let himself off the hook. The new endoskeleton, after all, was huge, much bigger than 5 and 6 footers Gil and his co-workers had been dragging around for so long. It was reasonable for Gil's fight or flight response to be triggered in the face of that kind of power, but there was no need for concern. The new robot was under Gil's control. Gil joined his team members as the robot and its systems grinding walked over to the nearest endoskeleton and picked it up as if it was made of flimsy fabric, effortlessly. The new clean-up robot snapped the endoskeleton's shoulder joints. The endoskeleton's arms and face came free. The robot tossed the arms aside. They landed on the floor with a skittering clatter. The robot did the same thing with the endoskeleton's legs, cracking the limbs from their hip joints and flinging them towards the arms. The metal arms and legs clanked in a tangle as the big robot grabbed the endoskeleton's heads and popped it off, grasping the head between its huge metal hands, and the cleanup robot rolled the skull towards the discarded limbs. As soon as the skull stopped moving, the robot lifted the remaining torso, stomping heavily across the black and white checkered linoleum. The robot carried the torso to the pile of limbs and dropped it. The torso landed with a crunch and a bang as the efficient new robot turned and headed towards another endoskeleton. Over the next couple of minutes, the new robot made a quick work of 3 more endoskeletons. The robot had no problem deconstructing the already partly broken endoskeletons and adding them to the growing pile by the door. Gil turned away from the robot. He beamed at his co-workers. "See? I'm a genius." He threw up his arms in triumph. Danny's mum had taught him to accept and respect all people, even the unpleasant ones. Danny didn't much like Gil, but he pretended that he did, and now he had to admit that Gil had done something pretty amazing. Even though Gil was bragging, which was something Danny had been taught never to do, Gil had reason to be pleased with himself. Danny opened his mouth to agree with Gil's self-esteem, but he never got the words out. What happened next stole his words, and some of his sanity as well. It happened so fast that it all melded together into one impossible horror that Danny's mind struggled to put into order. A blur of metallic motion, a squelching pop, Gil's caterwauling scream. Danny's mind computed all the events. Gil was screaming because he no longer had arms. The robot had ripped off Gil's arms. As the robot hurled Gil's arms towards a pile of robotic parts by the pizzeria exit door, the air left Danny's lungs and the strength fled his legs. Danny staggered back towards his heart pounding, not believing what he was seeing. He stared at gushing fountains of red spraying from Gil's shoulder sockets. Beside Danny, Carlo cried out. Danny glanced towards the two other men. Owen made no sound, but his face was white. His eyes were nearly bugging out of his face. Gil continued to scream. No, not scream. Shriek. Wail. The sounds Gil made were unlike anything Danny had ever heard. Those sounds were accompanied by sickening, cracking, crunching sounds. And even under all of that hideous racket, Danny could hear the wet slap of blood hitting the walls and the floor. Another wrenching crunch turned Danny's thoughts to a crazed and fearful babble, especially when the crunch cut off Gil's screams completely. The crunch, which was like the twisting snap of a screw being shorn free of its housing, silenced Gil in a fraction of a second. The old pizzeria had echoed with the wails of Gil's pain. The next, the high-pitched howls were gone. Now all that Danny could hear was his own and the others' staccato breathing. He also heard the metallic clanks and whirs of the robot, which was now heading their way. Danny, Carlo and Owen turned as one. They started to run towards the pizzeria's only exit. Before they took even a step through, several construction workers poured through the open doorway, tearing into the old pizzeria. Danny and his teammates were caught between the advancing robot and the converging workers. "What's going on down here?" one of the men called out. "We heard screams," and the man, a long-haired, muscle-bound, bald guy, Danny had seen. How'd you get a long-haired, bald guy? Danny had seen around a few times, stopping talking when his gaze landed on the bloody carnage that used to be Gil. His eyes bulged. "Run!" Carlo yelled. Danny was already running, careening through the confused and shocked men. Danny bounced off meaty arms and paunchy bellies, as if he was a pinball in one of those old arcade machines. The room was chaos, a sound of motion. Danny's senses couldn't even process it all. He only got disjointed impressions as he ran. Danny's ears registered metallic clanks and squishy thuds, more cracks and snaps and pops, wet splashes below and cries and shouts. His mind didn't even try to translate what he was hearing into actual events. He didn't want to think about it. A stream of vicious red spewed across one of the white squares onto the floor ahead of Danny. A press of chests and faces and blanched bones white and a ripped off arm. The dark skin and small oak leaf tattoo told him the arm had belonged to Carlo. When a round head tumbled across the floor in front of Danny and grasping a metal hand swiped his way, Danny darted to his left and dove between the legs of one of the panicked construction workers. More body parts flew past, more blood sprayed. Danny ran through a cacophony of hysteria, and everything Danny had ever learned about being polite and following the rules and respecting others was deconstructed along with the men around him. He cared about nothing but getting out of the pizzeria and abattoir. Danny dodged and dove and scrambled and flailed, and he finally reached the door. As he galloped through it, he looked back. The butchery continued. The tortured cries crescendoed, and he slammed the door. Danny kept running past piles of lumber and stacks of rebar, past more converging construction workers, and then he ran past rumbling cement truck, his mixing drum rotating, the grey sludge of wet cement sluicing from its discharge chute. Danny screamed at the men spreading the poured cement, "Seal it!" even shouting at the top of his lungs. Danny's words could be barely heard above the cement truck's roar and screams that reached out from the pizzeria and curled into Danny's brain like a vine wrapping round his consciousness. "Seal the door!" Danny screamed louder. He pointed towards the back entry of the pizzeria. The cement workers finally looked up. They turned, looked towards the pizzeria door. "Seal it!" Danny cried out again and kept running. And that is the end of that. Sorry if that was a long one, guys. I thought I'd actually read you guys the story instead of just compartmentalizing it for you. If you like this, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell notification ding ding so you never miss one. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.